This lesson is for PSD 303, and in this focus skill, our isolation and context questions will be in regards to reading tables and graphs. So you're going to be answering all sorts of different types of questions. There's not really one type of question here. It's just that in general, you're going to read a table and a graph and extract information from that and answer some questions. The extension skill for this is to perform computations on your data from tables and graphs, and to also be able to translate from one representation of the data to another. So you might be doing a bar graph and changing that into a pie chart, or vice versa. Okay? Alright, so let's get started. I want to start off with some review skills from PSD 202, and that's still reading charts and graphs and then answering questions based off of that. So here it says, what was the total time it took to complete trials 1 and 2? So when I look at this table and it asks me, total amount of time for trials 1 and 2, I'm going to look at trial 1 and 2 and the time here, and since it's asking me for the total, I'm just going to add 33 plus 30 seconds to get 63 seconds. So I'm going to answer this here with units, and my answer is 63 seconds. Now in question 2, it says, how much longer did trial 3 take compared with trial 4? So now I'm looking at trial 3's data and trial 4's data, and it asks how much longer 3 took than 4. So I'm going to take trial 3 and subtract away the time from trial 4. So trial 3 minus trial 4 gives me 3 seconds, and my answer here is 3 seconds. Okay, PSD 303's focus skill here is to still read stuff from a table, so it's not that much of a stretch, but it is going to ask you to do a slightly more complex math problem here. So it says, what is the distance of the ring from the HCl swab in centimeters at a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius? So the data here is a little bit more complicated. You have to read through this a little more carefully, but it asks for the distance of the ring. Okay, so that means I'm looking in this column here. That's the column where my answer is going to come from. Now, it wants the distance from the HCl swab in centimeters at a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. So I look at the temperature, and I'm looking at 30 degrees, and I scroll over here to the distance, and that answer would just be 4.1. So that's 4.1 centimeters. Okay, so it's just making the question seem a little bit more complex, but really it's the same skill that you did before, where you're just piecing something from a table. And then the last question for this table here, it says, at what temperature did the experiment take 33 seconds? So here I'm looking for specifically 33 seconds for the time, and I'm working backwards here. So 33 seconds for the time means I had a temperature, because that was what it's asking, temperature of 20 degrees. So it's 20 degrees Celsius at a temperature of 33 degrees. So these are really kind of similar type of questions. Now the extension question, though, is very different. Okay, so I'm going to bold this first and then come back to the data. It says, what is the average temperature recorded for all of the trials? So I want the average temperature recorded for all of the trials. That means I'm looking in this table here for the temperatures, and I'm just going to look at these numbers here and take the average. So that means I'm adding 20 plus 30 plus 40 plus 50 and dividing by 4. So the average here is something that you guys have already done, and that might be a review here. The next question I think is a little bit tricky, but my average, I just want to add this here. The average is 35 degrees. So to answer this question here, the average temperature is 35 degrees Celsius. Okay, the next question says, what percent of the trials lasted longer than 25 seconds? Okay, so lasted 25 seconds or longer. Now, when I look at these trials, for the amount of time that lasted 25 seconds or longer, I see that I have these three values that are above 25 seconds. So I'm going to look at this and say, okay, I have 3 trials that were above 25 seconds, or lasted longer, because this one is less than 25 seconds here. 3 out of the 4 trials. So when I find this percentage here, I take 3 and I divide that by 4 to get 0.75. And to change that into a percentage, I move that decimal 2 spots over, and that gives me 75%. So 75% of the trials lasted 25 seconds or longer. So this is a little bit more complex, because we are asking you to do an average here, or a percent problem using the tables. Okay, so it's a slightly more difficult type of question. Okay, now I would like you guys to try question number 7, which says to determine the percentage of the shirts sold that were purchased by each class. So you're going to pause the video here, and you're going to use this table here, this bar chart, bar graph here, and tell me what the percentage of shirts sold were purchased by the freshmen, the sophomores, the juniors, and the seniors. So go ahead and pause, and we'll work through this. Okay, so hopefully you're going to follow along with this and get all the correct answers. But when we're finding the percentage that are bought by each of these classes, first we need to figure out the total number of shirts that were actually sold altogether. So I went through each part of this graph here, and I said that there were 30 freshmen. This looks about halfway between 20 and 30 and 40. So 30 freshmen, 30 sophomores, 60 juniors, and 120 seniors who purchased the shirt. So that gives me, after I add up all of these different numbers, 240 total shirts sold. Okay, so a total of 240 shirts were sold. Okay, now the freshmen, if we're going to figure out their percentage of freshmen that purchased the shirt, we're going to take that number, the 30, and we're going to divide that by 240, the total. So we're going to take the total of freshmen and divide that by the total number of shirts in general that were sold. So I get a decimal, 0.125, that I'm going to convert into a percentage by moving that decimal spot two times to give me 12.5%. Now, what's nice about this problem is that I actually don't have to even do the sophomores, because when I look at the sophomores, they also sold 30 shirts. So I can just take that number and say that that's also 12.5%. Now, I want to ask you guys, before hopefully you just calculated the next one, if you just did 60 over 240, because that would be the juniors, right? 60 divided by 240. I want to know what would be a quicker way of doing this 60 here when you already have the answer for 30 shirts. Well, 30 is exactly half of the 60, right? So all we need to do is actually double this percentage here to get 12.5 times 2, and that's 25%. So either way, if I had done the the math here, 60 divided by 240, I would have gotten 0.25, and I can move that decimal 2 spots over. But since I'm noticing that the numbers are very similar, I can just double to get 25%. And then the seniors, let's use that same trick. The seniors had 120 shirts sold. So if we were not using the trick, I would use 120 divided by 240, because that's the total number of senior shirts divided by the total number of shirts in general, and I would get 0.50. So I can move that decimal 2 spots over. Actually, in your calculator, you know what, let me stop real quick. It would only say 0.5. Just because it doesn't have a number afterwards doesn't mean it can't have a 0. So you can add as many zeros as you wanted to that number, but just add 1 0 and then move the decimal 2 spots over to get 50%. But again, because that number, 120, is double the 60%, I should be able to just double this 25% here to get 50% also. Okay. All right. One way you can check to make sure that all of your numbers are actually correct is to make sure that when you add them all up, that they add up to 100%. Okay. Now the last question here says to create a circle graph that represents the information in the bar graph. Okay. So one thing that you need to do before you even try to make a circle graph is to make sure you have the breakdown of the percentages. So that's why we calculated that already. So we have the freshmen. They have 12.5% of the shirts that they purchased. The sophomores purchased another 12.5%. The juniors were at 50%, or I'm sorry, 25%. And the seniors were at 50%. So I think the easiest one here to start with would be to fill in the seniors at 50%, because I know that I can take exactly half of this pie chart here and fill it in for the seniors. Okay, so for the seniors, I'm doing this in blue, and if I'm gonna color that in, I want to label that somewhere. So I can either label it right on here in the graph, or I can put that off to the side, you know, and just write that you're putting that in blue. That's what I would want to see in your worksheets. Okay, now the next number that I think is also easy to do is the 25%, because that is a quarter of the whole pie. So I'm going to take a quarter of this pie, which means I'm going to create my own little division here. And I'm going to only do a quarter of this pie and call that the juniors. Now I have exactly the freshmen and the sophomores left over, and they are splitting the rest of the pie here. So I can just sort of show that I'm dividing this in half here. And I'm going to label that as freshmen and sophomores. And I'll fill that in with another 2 different colors here. And there we go. That's the end of this lesson. You'll be asked to do this a lot on this skill to create, a pie chart from a bar chart or back and forth. Okay? All right. I will see you guys or ask questions in class and get started.